Now it is time to bring in our opposition advisor of the week in our fantastically named feature, Chequers and Balances. Go on, Boris and Keir.
Chequers and Balances.
And this week, it gives me great pleasure to welcome James Meadway to Whitehall Sources, who was an advisor to John McDonnell when he was Shadow Chancellor. James, hello, welcome.
Hello.
Great to have you with us. Thank you for being here. I think one of the things to start with is kind of just an overview. I like to do this. An overview of Keir Starmer as an opposition leader, particularly in the face of Rishi Sunak. What's your kind of broad assessment before we get into the detail?
Well, he's got more of a challenge than he had with Boris Johnson. The contrast between the two worked well for him. Once we got out of the sort of the immediate coronavirus period in particular, I think the contrast between the two he could play up to. I think with Rishi Sunak, that's a harder task. I mean, they're both sort of occupying, at least presentationally, very similar spaces as you know, the kind of the sensible people who are going to say sensible things and think sensibly about what to do next. Now, underneath that, there's actually really quite a lot of difference between the two in terms of what they say they want to do with the economy, with wider society, the kind of sort of policies and programme that they're laying out. But at least presentationally, on sort of first glance, like this looks like a harder strategy for Keir to come up with to deal with him.
Well, just on that then, I want to play this, which is from Prime Minister's Questions this week, which is perhaps quite revealing in terms of how Rishi Sunak will deal with Keir Starmer as well, because that's worth considering in all of this. So let's take a listen.
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman rightly raised the topic of national security, because it is important. But this is the person who in 2019 told the BBC, and I quote, "I do think Jeremy Corbyn would make a great Prime Minister." Mr. Speaker, let's remember that national security agenda, abolishing our armed forces, scrapping the nuclear deterrent, withdrawing from NATO, voting against every single anti-terror law we tried, befriending Hamas and Hezbollah. He may want to forget about it, but we will remind him of it every week, because it's the Conservative government that will keep this country safe.
Okay, so that's Prime Minister's Questions in all its glorious theatrical drama. Kirsty, I think let's start with you on this, because from a Prime Minister's point of view, how much value do you place on that as a strategy? He said he's going to mention Jeremy Corbyn every single week.
Well, I mean, it's good knockabout stuff, isn't it, for PMQs? And it's a good line to rally the troops, and you can hear all the Conservative MPs in the background cheering him to the rafters on that. And I am struck, actually, by both his appearances. He's clearly going to be quite punchy at the dispatch box, much more punchy than I think people had anticipated. So you don't have, solid, sensible Keir up against the sound money man. So there's an attempt to make, to really take the fight to him. Will it work? I mean, we shall see, but Corbyn is the past. By the time we get to 2024 election, the 2019 election will be self-evidently 5 years away. I mean, yes, it is true. You could also say, this is a man that tried to stop Brexit. There's a few decent attack lines you can go at Starmer with, but I think it's more about cheering the troops behind than it is about persuading the public.
No, I would agree. I mean, there is a problem. It'll work for a bit, and I think Boris Johnson used it rather effectively, but that was coming straight out of the 2019 election. Memories are fresh at this point. By the time you get to 2024, it's really quite a long time away, and it's a long way since Jeremy Corbyn was anywhere near the leadership of the Labour Party, and people will be looking at what's immediately happened in the 5 years that the Tories have been in power, and that, I think, is the record that they'll have to work hard against. It's no use saying, well, yes, OK, this wreckage is bad, but imagine how much worse it would be if Jeremy Corbyn was in charge of it. And then, of course, Jeremy Corbyn isn't on the ballot paper as leader of the Labour Party in 2024. So it's a weak attack, but it does, exactly as said, it does do the job of rallying the troops behind you if you're at PMQs. I'm not sure how much it's going to cut with anybody else out there in the real world.
I wonder if there's a thing here, Oscar. Saying Starmer once wanted Jeremy Corbyn to be Prime Minister is the same sort of attack strategy as saying Sunak once wanted Boris Johnson to be Prime Minister. But that is the case, that Rishi Sunak wanted Boris Johnson to be Prime Minister. I just wonder how much you can taint somebody now with that support in the past.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, the thing I always wonder, and I don't know what the operation was like when you were there, Kirsty, but I was slightly probably disappointed in the polling kind of capabilities at number 10, or how much emphasis is placed on that. You know, you would presume, I guess, that these attack lines have been polled, and potentially they've been polled in communities, you know, like the Red Wall and the Purple Wall, as we now know as well. Because if they haven't, and it's just a new Prime Minister who's gone in, huge in tray, as we know, and PMQs is kind of, understandably, I guess, in terms of just sheer performative politics, is right at the bottom of the priority list. And they just think, yeah, this is just a really nice, easy kind of, as you said, morale-boosting attack line to go with. Because if it hasn't been polled, and it is just, as you said, you know, the Rishi wanting Boris and, you know, like, it just doesn't stand up for me at all. And particularly because the electorate now, I think, are more politically savvy and more politically aware than they ever have been. Largely that's kind of enforced because politics has just been so dominant, arguably for all the wrong reasons at times, in people's lives. And I think people see through that, and I just don't think it works at all. The other thing I would say on it, though, if it isn't due to polling, and I've said this before in previous podcasts, like, there is, and this is a horrible reality for the Conservative Party, Keir Starmer is relatively squeaky clean. There's not a lot of grub on that guy to play with. And I sometimes think it's just a rather slight, desperate attempt to try and take chunks off him, because they can't get him on the big stuff.
So I'm not entirely sure I agree with that, and actually because of focus groups and because of polling. Now, whether Team Sunak do a lot of focus groups and polling or not, the simple answer is I don't know, but there is enough out there to say actually the public aren't sold on Keir Starmer at all. There's a, you know, as we said before, you know, the Labour Party might be currently, you know, still ahead in the polls, but it's broad and it's shallow. And actually, if you listen to focus groups and watch focus groups or look at the polls, there's an underlying kind of trust element there with the public and Keir. They don't quite buy into Keir. They're not sure what he stands for, but they don't quite trust him. So actually, needling away at the things like, you know, you tried to stop Brexit, you know, you backed Corbyn, whilst it might sound, you know, on one level, and it is, you know, a law of ever diminishing returns, because the further you move away from 2019, the more kind of in the rear view mirror it gets, it actually serves to do something else, which is needle at that kind of instinctive lack of trust that the public have in Starmer.
You can see this in the sort of headline polling. I must say I'm quite, I wouldn't say I'm reassured, but it's interesting to hear from the other side that, you know, what you assume are carefully worked through attack lines honed by the finest polling brains in the land might not always be that. But just on Keir Starmer, I think there's you can see in the headlines that he's polling much less well against Rishi Sunak than against Liz Truss in terms of who do you want to be leader of the whole country, who would you want to be Prime Minister. But there's also this issue with him that quite deliberately, he and the people around him had a strategy for the last few years of not defining himself particularly positively around, you know, definite commitments to policies, definite things he's going to say. That has started to change. But they've had 2 years to basically be relatively sort of defensive and somewhat negative about that. And it has produced a blowback. There is a problem with saying that, OK, these are the things I stood to get elected as leader of the Labour Party on. Now they're not sort of really there anymore. These are things I just said. Now, on one level, you're just kind of bashing a load of lefty activists and who cares. On the other hand, it does start to stack up into a little bit of a thing that you don't have to work very hard to say, well, if he said that to these people he's saying these things to get elected, who knows what he might say to everybody else just to get elected somewhere down the line. So there is something that you can poke away at there. And I think the leadership needs to be a little bit more careful about.
Really interesting. I want to put this to you as well from Ed Miliband on Twitter. This is the tweet. Sunak on Thursday, I can't possibly go to COP. Sunak 6 days later, I can't possibly not go to COP. Ed Miliband says, the guy is a phony. And I just wonder how effective this sort of feeling of U-turns and changes of heart and all of that, is that something, James, that has cut through? And that sort of line, the guy is a phony, is that trying to make something stick on Sunak, do you think?
Well, it feels like it is, and we'll see whether it does. I mean, the Labour's ruled out. Probably, I think I can see why, and I can understand the reasons for it, and I think it makes sense. Ruled out, like going in for Sunak's very, very wealthy. What would he know about the real world? That sort of thing. I mean, it's sort of sitting there waiting to be used, but I don't think that would be something that the Labour front bench particularly want to get into. Not least because it starts to open up questions about, well, what might you do about people having phenomenal amounts of wealth? I mean, would you introduce wealth taxes? It's not a conversation they want to get into. Whether it's Sunak's a phony, and sort of a wider question about is he fake in some sense, I don't know. I don't know whether it's quite going to work. I'd find it hard sitting here to be able to say, well, how are people going to respond to that one? I mean, being a bit of a traditionalist, I do tend to think you have to go on, like, what is the policy? What is the thing you say you're going to do? Never mind how you're saying it or who is saying it. What is it you want to do, and stick closely to that. And on that one, I think Labour's on very solid ground, because it doesn't look good coming up over the next few weeks, what the Tories say they're going to do relative to what they said they were going to do in 2019.
Is that something, Oscar? I'm always intrigued. I think COP was a really interesting one, because when we were doing the radio programme on Times Radio, we were getting loads of texts saying Sunak should go, or at least should find a solution. Why doesn't he join virtually? Why is he not going? Why has he banned the King from going? And then all of a sudden, he is going. And so I just wonder, issues like that, they can feel almost unimportant, but is it a pattern of behaviour? Are we already seeing that at this point?
Well, I mean, he's kind of slightly come out of this issue with the worst of both worlds, in kind of saying you're not going to go, fine. I think there's a plausible rationale for not going, and I think actually the right of the Conservative Party and to the right of Conservative voters actually really praised him for that. And then as soon as a certain Boris Johnson says that he's attending, you then suddenly rush back and you don't get any of the credit for it. So you don't even get the credit of doing the right thing that you sometimes get with doing a quick and decisive U-turn. So he's come out of that completely slightly embarrassed, I think. I do think it's slightly unimportant, though. I think it's a reflection, actually, of a more healthy political kind of issues news cycle we've got. As we said at the start of the podcast, 2-3 weeks ago, I think it would have been well down the list in terms of spotlight. The only thing I would say on it, Rishi Sunak, there are some politicians that I think can get away with, in inverted commas, U-turns. And they get away with it by being kind of, I'm a pragmatist. Political climate and issues change, and the emphasis I need to place on this issue can change week to week depending on factors. And because I'm a pragmatist, I will make a decision based on those factors. I think he can get away with that more than most. They're very definitive kind of brute force kind of character leaders. I think Boris is someone who was a little bit like that. I think Jeremy Corbyn was someone like that. So when they make a U-turn, it feels more dangerous for them, I think. Where he's a pragmatist. He's a smart kind of prefect pragmatist politician.
A prefect pragmatist, I like that. James, while we've got you on, I want to ask you about Rachel Reeves, who is now the Shadow Chancellor, of course. Even today, we're recording this on Thursday, of course. She's going to be speaking. We expect her to say this. This is what has been briefed. As a country, we've become not only more unequal, but also poorer. The problems we face are global, but Britain's unique exposure each time has been down to a failure to get to grips with more than a decade of weak growth, low productivity and underinvestment and widening inequality. I believe we can overcome these challenges, etc., etc. Is that the sort of messaging that Labour need to cling to and that the Conservatives need to be more aware of? You were speaking there about the depth of policy that you would be looking for.
I think so. I think she's in the right sort of place with this, and it obviously plays to her own sort of personal strengths, given her background as an economist and where she comes from in the party, to talk in a fairly sort of level-headed, serious. These are the problems we face, and this is what we do about them. The challenge, I think, for Labour right now, and I think Rachel Reeves and the people around her have done a good job of detailing what those problems are. It might sort of question the order of priorities that you place them, that you need to talk more about people's actual experiences, like what has happened to your wages, what has happened to the amount of rent you pay, that sort of thing, rather than just generically about growth. We saw what happened to Liz Truss when you just say, OK, growth's a big thing. doesn't mean very much to most people. But in terms of detailing some of the problems and starting to lay out a plan, I think she's got some distance on this. The challenge for Labour is the one that we're all going to face, and all the big economies are facing this. It's not entirely unique to Britain, but we are in a worse place with it than others, which is, well, how do we pay for some of this stuff? Interest rates are rising around the world. It is more expensive for the government to borrow than it used to be. Frankly, we're in a worse place in this than we need to be, given the experience of the last sort of 10, 12 years or so. But actually, the cost question is the one that kicks in here. And that's going to involve some discussion about tax rises. And that's going to involve saying who's going to pay for some of these nice plans to change the economy and the rest of it. And really, unless Labour start talking about this now, it's something that's going to bite you on the bum come the election, because then it's Labour tax bombshell and all of a sudden tax rises for everybody. Or alternatively, you just turn around and disappoint all your supporters and lots of people who might want to vote for you and say, actually, we can't really do anything. That might be quite tempting for some of them, but I think would be electorally an extremely bad place for Labour to get to. So it's not easy being Shadow Chancellor. In many ways, one of the hardest jobs, and I would say this, I suppose, I mean, I only had to advise someone trying to do it, in British politics. But I think Rachel's done a very good job of detailing the problems and saying roughly where she wants to go on this. But there's a whole set of other big political questions bearing down on the Shadow Treasury team now.
We love that insight into what it was like to be an advisor. That's what we do on this podcast. And it strikes me that the other day, Wes Streeting was on the radio saying, the Conservatives are welcome to steal this idea. They should steal the whole thing. They should just go for it. How much of a concern is that for you when you're advising the Shadow Chancellor, that you're coming up with these great ideas that you definitely want to implement should you be elected, and then actually they might get stolen?
No, this is good. This is good. You know you're winning when your political enemies are making your arguments for you. And this is what Thatcher said about Tony Blair famously, that her biggest victory, or possibly this is apocryphal, but it will do for the example, that her biggest victory was Tony Blair leading the Labour Party, that if your opponents agree with your arguments, this is good. I mean, this is what Boris Johnson, 2019 manifesto, you can look at that and say, well, somebody's taken a close look at what Labour was saying in 2017 and done a kind of Tory version of it, right? So this, to me, this is like the argument is being won. Things are moving in the right direction here. Then the question is, what do you do next? Where do you go to after that? And that's probably the harder part, but it's a good dilemma to have.
Just to that point, the question I really wanted to ask you, James, because I did a TV appearance with a former advisor to Corbyn, and we got onto, it was just after Rishi had been appointed, and I was kind of reeling off his long list of successes as Chancellor, and one of them being the furlough scheme. And it was put to me that actually you guys had, behind the scenes, had put on a huge amount of pressure for the government to take up such a furlough scheme. I was just wondering what that was like for you and what the reality was there.
Well, sadly, I'd left. I wasn't working for John by that point, so I quit some time ahead of the 2019 election. But my understanding is, I mean, look, the furlough scheme comes from a number of different places. The TUC were arguing for something similar, but my understanding is that this was something that had been pushed heavily by John, the Shadow Treasury team at the time, and eventually turns into the policy that works, and that Rishi Sunak got the political benefit of. You can make a reasonable case that he wouldn't be Prime Minister now without the impacts of the furlough scheme for a long period of time. Understandably, in the middle of a huge and frightening crisis, you're the guy handing out lots of money to people. Understandably, he was popular on the back of this, but it's a good point. It was the right thing to do. You can question some of the details around it. It was basically the right thing to do. So that isn't a bad point to get to. Like, if you're in politics to try and make a difference, it's not bad that people are doing sort of the right things. And actually, if you want to advance on doing the right things and do more, it's good to have that in the bag and then think about what you do next. I mean, the furlough scheme, can I be blunt? I think the furlough scheme has opened up the broader question about public spending. I think austerity is going to be harder this time round. It's going to be harder anyway, but it's going to be a lot harder, I think, because of the impact of furlough. Because actually people have had an experience of what government could do and how things could be different and could be quickly different in a way that they didn't have perhaps a few years before that.
Really interesting. James, thank you so much. Thanks for taking the time. Great
worries.
to have
Thank
you
you
on.